All right, hello. Today we are going to cover actually a little bit more than I had originally put on the planning guide, and that's really just because when I was looking at it, it's like, oh, it's a pretty short tutorial to really get through the lesson activity. So I added in the H.G. Wells one. No big deal if you hadn't done that work already. This will just help you get through it when you get there. So um, previously, we covered the Victorian era and the idea that there was some sense of like prudishness, and it was very much about social class. That was like such a huge thing about Victorian era. Um, and so when we're approaching the end of that, it's sort of like you'll see a lot more critiquing of that idea. But something that's really important to understand about this period of time was colonialization. So remember, America, we began as a British colony, and many, many, many other places were at once a British colony. They were the largest ruling body in the world for a period of time, and then now they're really quite small in comparison. So India is one of the nations that has been most affected by British colonialism, and that's really what our lesson activity today focuses on. So, what I actually want to do is read through the questions for the lesson activity and then go back into the tutorial because the tutorial gives you pretty much all the answers. So, it the lesson activity is over a story by Rudyard Kipling's Kim. And if you recognize that name, it would be because of the Jungle Book, most likely. But he wrote other books and poems and things like that. So, first question is, why might Kipling have used India as a setting for the novel? So again, Rudyard Kipling was a British man, so it was commonplace for British people to like write stories using British colonies, especially for what like he's trying to show in terms of class. It'll come up when we go through stuff. And then explain how Kim's heritage influences his relationships with the people he encounters, including his friends. What does Kim think about the British who live in India? And then we actually get examples in the tutorial here. And then part C is an opinion that you need to form. And hopefully going over some of this will help you. So modern readers will benefit from reading novels such as Rudyard Kipling's Kim. Write a short argument for or against it, and then explain why. So hopefully going through some of this will help. So a bit about Rudyard Kipling. He was actually born in India, although his family were British. So he spent the early part of his life in India, then went to England, and then returned. And so he lived in England and really saw the effects of colonialism. So much of his work focuses on the British Empire. He is known for his vivid portrayals of characters from various cultures. He is most well known for his children's writing, which The Jungle Book is a children's book. He was part of a small group of writers that found inspiration in non-traditional sources, which were the British colonies. So he focused on the geographic beauty and the complicated reality of colonialism. So it's this juxtaposition, these two differing ideas that like look at this beautiful place and then sort of the really bad parts of colonialism. So while Kipling is lauded for his writing, he has been harshly criticized for his politics, particularly for supporting the notion of the white man's burden. So this is this idea that as white people, it is the white man. Let's be real, it's the white man. It's never the white woman. It's always men. So it is the white man's duty to civilize and tame the native populations that they come upon. So basically, taking like whatever culture of that place that they've come to colonize. Does this sound familiar? And as white men, it is their goal to make them more civilized in the same sense that they see civilization. So their culture, whatever civilization they're coming into that may have been there way longer than the white man, they don't care. They view it as like they have to bring Christianity, they have to bring all these civilized ideas. So think about that, specifically when we're thinking about like why would he have chosen this place as the setting, right? So we'll get a little bit more into that when we start talking about what the writing is about. But okay, give me 1 second. I gotta turn this light off. It's giving me a headache. Whew, okay. Sorry if I'm a little darker now, but that was really hurting my eyes. Okay. I should put my glasses on. So Kim was published in 1901 and it takes place in India. So it's a story about a white boy. He is like clearly not from India, but he is an orphan. And so but because he's an orphan, he's always outside. And so he appears to be of darker skin. And so he blends in with the other Indians living in India. So that's sort of like what we have going on here. He's this white person blending himself, despite his like original heritage. So I know that we get asked, so why might he have used India as a setting? Well, if he's exploring the ideas of colonialism and the white man's burden, that is a major thing that is going on in this period of time. And then, so now we're going to look at how Kim's heritage, so remember, he is white, but he does not appear to be white. He appears to blend in with the Indian people, the people of India that he's around. And then what does he think about the British living in India? So again, here we get this idea that it is a children's book, but it explores a serious theme of identity and the effects of colonialism. Kim and a native boy named Chota Lal are playing. So this scene is meant to emphasize the white man's power. So Kim, sat in defiance of municipal orders astride the gun Zamza on her brick platform opposite the old Ajabi Ghar, the wonder house as the natives called the Lahore Museum. Who holds Zamzama, that fire-breathing dragon, hold the Punjab, for the great green bronze piece is always the first of the conqueror's loot. And so you get this idea here. Earlier, Kim had playfully kicked his native friend off the cannon because British people like Kim have control over the native Indian people that are living there. So this is a game like you may have played as a child, King of the Mountain, but just this is showing like Kim recognizes his whiteness and uses it against the people around him. So right here, right? So we explain how his heritage influences the relationships with the people he encounters. He knows he's white, even though he tries to blend in. So that's one part about how his heritage goes in there. And then, so he is technically British, but he looks and acts like a native Indian. He's somewhere in between the two. Though he turned as black as any native, though he spoke the vernacular by preference, and his mother tongue in a clipped, uncertain sing-song, which would be English versus what language they're speaking there. Though he consorted to terms of perfect equality with the small boys of the bazaar, Kim was white, a poor white of the very poorest. He is estranged from the white British men and women in India, and he feels the same mistrust of the colonizers that many Indians do. But he still views himself as superior to the native people, even though he is distrustful of the colonizers. So it's a really interesting dichotomy that he falls into, in terms of his identity of knowing that he's white and therefore feeling superior, and then also mistrusting other white people because of the situations that he's living So hopefully that gives you that idea, because we've had it explained, you get some excerpts to support it, and then think about this, does it benefit you to read a novel about a white child living as a non-white child who still thinks he's better than everybody, but also mistrusts colonialism? And keep in mind that Rudyard Kipling's view throughout it is going to still be pushing that colonialism is the way to go. So you're just basically trying to think, like, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing for part C? So like I said, most of this information is just right in the first slides, like right before this lesson activity pops up. Hopefully it helps. If not, you can totally listen to a reading of Kim. It was very long, and that's why I didn't get anything, and there's not a whole lot on YouTube regarding it in English. So the next one is the H.G. Wells tutorial. So H.G. Wells himself was an author, known mostly as a science fiction writer. The Industrial Revolution is really what brought about the idea of science fiction, because really for the first time you have like this idea about machinery in a much different sense, and just how much things have changed so quickly. So if you think about, like, I know that you didn't live in those times because neither did I, but if you think about like 1900 versus 2019, and then you take those, let's go just say 120 years. So if you look at what has happened and how much the world has changed in the last 120 years, but then you went back and looked at like 1780 to 1900 and looked at how much didn't necessarily change, really gives you an idea of why the scientific or the science fiction and the Industrial Revolution are so intertwined, because people really started seeing possibilities that they had never seen before, just because of like machinery. A lot of science fiction came out of this idea of like the unknown, and a lot of it was based in fear. But then people just really thought about like the optimism of what the future could hold, if you're thinking more in terms of like a perfect society or a utopia. There's also a lot of science fiction that's dystopian, which is about like things being really bad, and that's sort of what we're going to look at in the Time Machine, which is what the focus is for this. So we talked a little bit in sense about science fiction with Frankenstein, because you have this idea of this guy building a machine to bring a person back to life. That is an element of science fiction, because it is taking science and ideas that sound scientific and then changing it into something that's not real. Like, we don't have those machines. Let's get through some of this. Okay. So H.G. Wells was, again, an early science fiction novelist. He kind of made himself infamous for reading The War of the Worlds over the radio, and people didn't realize that it was a story. Like, they tuned in and they hear about like all these alien ships coming in, and it totally freaked people out because they had no idea that it wasn't real, like when they were first hearing it. But some background on that. Let's keep going through here. Okay. He was born in a working class family, and so again, remember that this is the end of the Victorian era, and so he's thinking about class in a much different way than the Victorians would. So we'll talk about it a little bit. I don't really want to go through these. You can go through that on your own. Okay, I'm not going to show this video because I have a thing, but the Time Machine is about a man who they just call the time traveler, and he creates a time machine and he goes into the future. For us, he would be going like 807 or 807,000, something like that, uh, years into the future. And so then he ultimately like meets these two groups of people. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play like a summary of the whole thing, just so that you like have a little bit more context about like what the whole story is about, and then specifically a summary of chapter 5, which is what you're being asked to read. And then we'll go back through some of this, but I want to look at the questions real fast so you know what to focus on. So how does the time travelers seem to feel about the Eloi and the Morlocks? What does the excerpt from chapter 5 reveal the time traveler's initial theory of the social structure is? And then what's his first impression of the relationship between the two races that he finds on the planet? What does it reveal about his view of capitalism and the classes of society in Britain? And then the last one is just sort of about like Darwinism. So we'll go back and talk, because that pops up in those earlier slides. And then for the last one, I have it kind of broken down in a different way that I'll go over. But really the first 3 are what we're focusing on. So I'm just going to get back here. Okay, let's get to those videos. We're going to do the whole plot summary, like I said, first, and then we'll go into just chapter
5. Let's summarize the plot of The Time Machine. In the introduction, the time traveler introduces his theories about time travel, and then his actual time machine, to a group of assembled men, and he shows them a working model of the time machine. During the rising action, the group reconvenes at the house a week later, and the time traveler isn't there. The guests sit down to dinner when the time traveler appears, pale, dirty, and bleeding, claiming to have traveled through time. Almost the entirety of the rest of the novel is the time traveler's recalling of his adventure to his guests. That morning, the time traveler set out in his time machine. Flying into the future, he crashed on a little lawn in the year 802,701. He observed strange, beautiful, but derelict buildings, a white sphinx, lush gardens, and small, innocent people called Eloi, who act like children. He rescues a drowning Eloi named Weena, who then becomes devoted to him. The time traveler comes across a large circular well with a ladder. He hears deep humming within and guesses that it's a ventilation shaft for some sort of underground facility. At night, he thinks he sees what is a ghost or a white monkey creeping around. The next morning, he finds his time machine has disappeared. Following marks on the ground, he surmises that it's inside the hollow pedestal of the Sphinx statue. Descending a well, he comes to a tunnel where he encounters the strange human-like creatures called Morlocks. Because they live in darkness, they're all white, apish, with grayish-red eyes. He looks into a large chamber where some are eating meat and realizes to his horror that it's Eloi flesh. After narrowly escaping, he theorizes that over time humankind developed into 2 species, capitalists and laborers. The rich, educated people became the Eloi, kind and innocent but weak. The workers who built subways and railroads became the Morlocks. The time traveler stops his story to reveal to his guests flowers Weena put in his pockets. Continuing his story, the time traveler sees a large building that he calls the Palace of Green Porcelain, which turns out to be a museum. At night, he and Weena are attacked by Morlocks when they camp. The time traveler lights matches to drive them away. During the novel's exciting climax, the time traveler and Weena are attacked again, camping in the forest. And using a fire and a club as his weapons, the time traveler drives the Morlocks away. Tragically, Weena dies in the melee. Returning to the Sphinx, the time traveler finds the pedestal open. Morlocks are waiting for him, but he manages to leap into the machine and lift off, just in the nick of time. Phasing into the falling action, the time traveler lands millions of years later into a future that's like an alien planet. In the time machine's resolution, he finishes recalling his present tale. The next day, the narrator returns to the time traveler, finding him with a camera and a knapsack, setting off again to explore time. The narrator observes the machine disappear in a blur, and reports that the time traveler has not been seen since.
All right, so that's like the whole plot summary for that one. And then now, this one is just on the chapter.
In Chapter 5 of The Time Machine, the full moon rises as the time traveler looks from high atop a hill, perched in an ornate but decaying throne of a chair, to where he left the time machine, but he doesn't see it. Terrified, he races back to the little lawn where he landed only to discover the time machine has vanished. The time traveler feels the presence of an unseen but powerful force, and he doesn't believe the little people are strong enough to have moved the machine, let alone sustain curiosity about it. Searching the area, he startles some sort of white animal that he takes for a small deer. Weeping, the time traveler eventually falls asleep. The next morning, he wakes up determined to make the best of his situation. He will learn the ways of his new civilization. Examining the lawn more closely, the time traveler notices a single groove and narrow footprints leading to the pedestal on which the white sphinx stands. Knocking on the pedestal, he discovers it's hollow, which leads him to believe the machine is inside. After banging on the pedestal's bronze panels, he gives up and instead explores the surrounding countryside. He comes across a number of circular wells. He hears a thudding motion from below, which he concludes is part of some sort of subterranean ventilation system. Later that day, the time traveler rescues a little drowning woman from a river. Her name is Weena, and she then follows him wherever he goes. The time traveler comes across a strange white ape-like creature in the shadows that runs away when he touches it. Following it, he watches as it climbs down a ladder inside one of the wells. It strikes the time traveler that perhaps mankind has not remained one species, but had evolved into two distinct animals. One inhabits the surface, the other below. But what is this creature's role? And what is down below? He concludes that this second species has evolved as an underground creature. That's why it is white, like most animals that live in the dark. It has large eyes and avoids the daylight. There must be a vast system of underground tunnels. All of this, he concludes, is the inevitable result of a gradual widening of the gap between the capitalist and the laborer. The workers built the subways and railroads. The educated wealthy got better educated and more refined. It must be that the haves are above and the have-nots are below. The time traveler admits in his narration here that this was not fully the case. In Chapter 5 of The Time Machine, the time traveler discovers that there are actually two sets of creatures living in this future world. The Eloi, the little people, and the Morlocks, the nearly blind, white, primate-like creatures that live underground. The themes of evolution and class struggle surface here. Drawing on Charles Darwin's ideas about the evolution of species, the time traveler believes that humankind has diversified, but not in a single straight line. Instead, it has evolved into two separate species based around labor and luxury. In this future land, the social classes of the 19th century have evolved into separate species of humans.
Okay. I have a joke about eating the rich. Just kidding. Okay. So basically, what this chapter really focuses on is this concept that the future has split the social classes so divisively, and that you really got an upper class and a lower class. You have the people that do all of the work, who create everything, um and they've evolved into these beings that are living underground and all of that. And then you have the Eloi, who are just like, they don't do anything, but they're the upper class. They're the ones with all the money. They're the ones with all of the power. And so it's just this idea that, you know, like in the video, he says there's the haves, the people who have everything, and the people who have nothing, and or how society runs, and that disparity between the two. Keep in mind, we're also talking about like 800,000 years of evolution that he's kind of contemplating in this. But this kind of is based off of the idea of Darwin's origin of species, and the idea of the survival of the fittest. And so he and Wells is basically taking that idea that social Darwinism, which is like, if you're dumb and you're not wealthy and you are just a laborer, you will continue to breed people who are dumb and just are poor and are just there to work, and that is how the species is going to survive. And so it's just like social Darwinism is this idea that the people with will continue to grow and will continue to get richer and richer and richer, and the poor get poorer, is really like the essential concept. It's also very racist. Um, so Wells didn't necessarily believe in this idea of social Darwinism. He believed more in socialism rather than capitalism. And capitalism is really what creates the idea of the Eloi, like the idea that there's like these rich people that live above. And so at first, when he first gets there, and this is one of the questions that you're asked, is about like his initial idea. So he assumes that because like they look like they're wealthy, they're super intelligent, and because they're like this higher class, but they're lazy and weak and stupid because they don't do anything and they don't have to think. Yet the Morlocks, who are the working class, who under social Darwinism would generally considered to be the stupid ones, are actually the more intelligent because they're the ones who are surviving and they are building all of the things that make society run. Um, and my joke about eating the rich is just that H.G. Wells is the first person who made that a thing, with the Morlocks eating the Eloi in the story, because they are literally eating the rich. Just a joke. So by showing the like struggles of both of the classes, he's really trying to say like social Darwinism doesn't benefit anybody. The upper classes would just evolve into being lazy, weak, ignorant people, and then the working classes, he kind of shows as like these really fierce, cruel, animalistic type people. And it's this idea that that's not how things would evolve, and that idea that social Darwinism brings up is really like false. This isn't how things would ultimately go about. So he's saying that that idea, where he's basically pointing out the exploitation of Victorian industrialists versus the working classes. So how does the time traveler seem to feel about the Eloi and the Morlocks? We get a lot of that information in both the video and then in those previous couple of slides. You get this idea, like at first he obviously thinks the Eloi are really like, oh, these must be the intelligent like society that we evolve into, and then he realizes that they're kind of like incompetent, and then the Morlocks are just kind of scary, like they're non-human looking, they look like apes, they're white, they're nearly blind because they live underground, they don't get light. So how does he feel about them when he encounters them? How does the excerpt from chapter 5 reveal his initial theory of the social structure? So remember, at first he thinks like, oh, like this is the upper class, they're the educated, and then like all of that, he thinks that they work in harmony together when he first arrives. And so that's his first impression. And then he realizes what's really going on, and really the difference between the two races in that society. And then how does it show capitalism? I explained that, right? Like he has this idea like, oh, if this is what capitalism does to people, like it ultimately makes them exploitative and weak and lazy and unintelligent because they're ultimately just pushing everything onto the lower classes of society. So he is arguing heavily against capitalism with that idea, and more that everybody should do their part so that we all succeed as a society together. Okay. Charles Darwin's theories on evolution had a major impact on Victorian ideas about the world and humanity's place in it. His theory of natural selection suggested that species could survive intense competition and adapt to their environment. The species that could survive the competition and adapt to their environment were genetically superior and were the ones that survived. So when they're talking about social Darwinism, they believed that the upper class was genetically superior. So that means, like, if you're born into the upper class, you are better than somebody who is born into the working class. Your genes were better. You were naturally going to be more intelligent. That's what they believed. Obviously not correct, right? And so how in this chapter do we see that he's critiquing that concept? So again, think about how the Eloi actually are versus what his initial perception of them are, and how that is really showing that social Darwinism isn't real. Okay, and then this question, it asks you to respond in 3 to 4 paragraphs. There is a really easy way to break this up into those 4 paragraphs. And so I'm just gonna highlight in different colors how you would answer these to get like those 4 different paragraphs. So many people believe that science fiction stories are tales about incredible gadgets or scientific wizardry, and that they lack any serious element of literature. So here's the first paragraph that you would write. What was your notion about science fiction as a literary genre before you read the excerpt from The Time Machine? Okay, so what did you think about science fiction before we went over this excerpt, like in terms of thinking about, like, does it lack any serious element? So that's one. Whoops, I just knocked something off my desk. And then, oh, I guess I only broke it down into 3. Oh, here it is. There we go. Okay, so this one, did reading The Time Machine change your opinion of the genre? If so, in what way did your opinion change? So please don't just write like no. If it's no, why didn't it? And if it did, why did it? Remember, complete sentences. Yeah, this is English 12. We should be writing in complete sentences. Paragraph 3. I'm not asking for long paragraphs too. And then the next one, would you classify The Time Machine as a serious literary work or a simple tale? What literary aspects lead you to this conclusion? So that's 2 questions again. Third paragraph really wraps that up nicely. And then in the end, how would you rate The Time Machine from a literary perspective? Final. There you go. That's the end. That's the conclusion. So these are just things that you need to think about. I can't form these opinions for you, but they're there. A lot of good information in the text. And as always, you can read it. I will also include a link to the reading. It's about 30 minutes, 35 minutes long. So I didn't want to just sit here and play you the reading of it. But if you're having trouble really coming up with answers, I do recommend playing the reading of it in the background and trying to think like and read along with it and just get that idea. But that's all for today's class. And so next week we'll just cover war literature, and then I'll give you some test prep. We'll be good to go, and then we'll be nearly done. So, all right. Hopefully you found that useful, and enjoy the rest of your day.